I'd like to begin by thanking the Islamic Society at Surrey University for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here once again. Now, what I want to discuss this evening is something that touches us all. It transcends culture, location, gender, and whether we want to consider it or not. The most fundamental question in philosophy is to question our existence. What's the point of it all? Imagine you were walking through the woods somewhere in Surrey, and you were knocked unconscious, and you found yourself. You awoke and found yourself in some foreign piece of land, in the middle of a desert, let's say. What would be the first questions that you would ask yourself? Where am I? What am I doing here? Who got me here? Now, those questions are important to the one who is lost. But if we fail to answer those questions about our own existence, we will be eternally lost. I, for one, don't believe that we're cosmic orphans and that we are, in fact, lost. But our lives have meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose. And those questions of identity, who am I, what am I doing here, what's the point of it all, can simply be answered by a formula: I am Muslim. But before I expand upon this, what about if I don't believe in God? Can I have meaning and purpose? Does life make sense without meaning and purpose? Can I just live my life without even considering meaning and purpose in my life? Can man live without God? Carl Sagan, a noted atheist astronomer, in the book Pale Blue Dot, Carl Sagan concentrates on an image taken 4 billion miles away by the Voyager spacecraft. And he says this: because of the reflection of the sunlight, the Earth seems to be sitting in a beam of light, as if there were some special significance in this small world. But it's just an accident of geometry and optics. Our imagined self-importance, the delusion of some prevailed position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great and developing cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all its vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. He also says, who are we? We find that we live in an insignificant planet on a humdrum star lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of the universe, in which there are far more galaxies than people. Stephen Hawking has also described man as being a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet. This insignificant chemical scum resides in a universe that is forever expanding, and as it continues to expand, it moves further and further apart. And as it does so, it becomes colder and colder as the energy is used up. All the stars will die. All matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no life. There will be no light and no heat. There will be no humanity. What kind of meaning can we conjure up? What kind of notion can we hope to have in a horrific scenario such as this? Not only each and every one of us here will pass out of existence, but the entire human race is destined for destruction, doomed to destruction. Now, some of us may say that, yes, but I have importance relative to certain events in my life. I am important in my life. But all I will say to this is this: what kind of significance can that bring about when all that we have is a destruction of mankind? Does it really matter? Does it really matter whether you exist or not exist? Does it really matter that you're here and you contribute to anything, have an impact on anything? Whether it's the dedication of one's life to charity, the contributions to science, the research of the doctor to alleviate pain and suffering, the efforts to secure peace in the world, sacrifices for others, the conquering of lands, the building of illustrious and magnificent buildings, writing a bestseller, to establish a family, to accumulate a fortune, to strive for further progress and prosperity, the long hours of study, our jobs, our friendships. In a final analysis, all of this is utterly meaningless. We attach meaning to these things in hope that we transcend death by participating in something worth lasting. But in the end, it will all amount to nothing, absolutely nothing. Because our lives are ultimately meaningless, therefore whatever we fill our lives with, it will be meaningless. What about the greats of the Enlightenment? What about the great atheist thinkers of our time in the previous century? The champions of living a life without God. What did they see when they looked at the world? Voltaire, he saw this. He said, I saw a worm crawling on the earth, and the bird going and destroying the worm and consuming it. Then he saw the eagle coming and destroying that bird. Then he saw a human being take his gun and shoot the eagle apart, and then the human being meets his fellow human being on the battlefield and killing one another. And that worm enters the human being's body and devours it. He says the miseries of each are supposed to make up the good of all. Voltaire is capturing the unshakable meaningless of our lives. The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell laminated. He said that man is a product of causes which had no provision of end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his love, his beliefs are but the outcomes of accidental co-locations of atom. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve the individual life beyond the grave. That all the labours of all the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to destruction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of the universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Bertrand Russell wants us to embrace this depressing depiction of man. Now, some of us may feel uncomfortable with this depiction, this picture that's painted before us. It is uncomfortable, it is frightening, but it is consistent, my friends. Think of it like this. There are computer games where we can build virtual lives. We can have friendships. We can build families. We can get jobs, accumulate a wealth. We can become kings and queens and rule armies and empires and conquer other civilizations. But when we turn the power off, does any of those days, nights, months of gameplay, does it amount to anything at all? Absolutely not. In the same way, when we play the game of life, and day in, day out, we fill out the motions of life 24/7, and then it's game over, and we pass away. Does it amount to anything whatsoever? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No meaning whatsoever. It amounts to nothing whatsoever. Man is like a criminal sentenced to death, killing time before his sentence date. That's all that we are without God. It does not make a difference whether you exist or you don't exist, or whether you existed at all. Absolutely no difference whatsoever. What about purpose? Does man have purpose without God? Without God, the universe is nothing more than a cosmic accident, a graveyard of matter. Then what of man? What is man? Man is nothing more than a freak of nature. a freak of nature. He has no goal. A journey without a destination. No goal, no purpose. So then, is it all for nothing? Is it absolutely nothing? There's no reason why we're here. Absolutely no purpose, no reason. Well, listen to Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist from Harvard, a confessed anti-theist. Listen to what he says. We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. Because comets struck the Earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not to otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a literal sense, because the Earth never froze over entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We yearn for higher answer, but none exists. Man is nothing but a byproduct of a lengthy evolutionary process. He's an accident, a product of chance, absolute chance. Man is nothing but, and only can be viewed as, a product of chance, some matter, and some time. Qualitatively, you have as much purpose in your lives as much as a rat's life. Indeed, the French atheist existentialist philosopher Camus, confronted with the absurdity of life, where there was a mismatch of what human beings need and the reality that was faced in front of him. He said this: there is but one true serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to the most important fundamental question in philosophy. Shall we even continue to live once we're confronted with the absurdity of life? How then does modern man continue? How does he cope with the absurdity of life? Can he just ignore it? Can he just ignore a life without any meaning or purpose? About 20 years ago, there was an article in Psychology Today by Martin Seligman, who is from the University of Pennsylvania. And what he did was to analyze the baby boomer generation, the 1960s generation, and he compared it to 3 generations before it. And Seligman had discovered that there was a not 5, not 6, not 7, but a 10-fold increase in the number of people suffering from depression. So there was a 10-fold increase in that single generation span, more than any other generation in the history of America. And Seligman says that if there was a 10-fold increase in heart disease, it would be considered an epidemic. And he says we're well within our rights to say that this was an epidemic of depression. But then he asked the important question, why? Why was there this increase of depression? And his answers were staggering. The reason that there was this increase was because that people in that generation had lost the art of relating their day-to-day lives for something beyond that life. They somehow lost the ideal, the view that their lives were in actual fact true and genuine. They lost the concern of relating their day-to-day lives to a larger purpose, a larger cause, because they believe now that there was no larger cause, there was no greater purpose. And what did they do? They started to create meaning for themselves. In the words of Seligman, they became narcissistic. And Seligman says, anyone who turns to simply creating meaning for themselves is going to end up a very, very, very depressed person. So this question of meaning and purpose simply won't go away. It will haunt us, whether you think that it has no answer, whether you think in principle it has no answer, or you think that you should just ignore it and carry on. It will haunt us, whether we like it or not. The lack of meaning and purpose in our lives is absolutely inescapable. So in that case, we can't ignore this question. We can't ignore the meaning and purpose, the lack of it in our lives. So then how does he cope? How does modern man cope? You have to appreciate the fact that this is very, very new. This problem is relatively new to the history of mankind. This is what we could describe as a blip in the history of man. Modern man's dilemma of living without any meaning and purpose is very, very new. Because people have always believed in God in some manner or form. They have always had a religion. But then came, for example, up until the 15th century, it was culturally and intellectually inconceivable not to believe in God. God defined all aspects of reality. When man looked at the world and wanted to find a solution to a problem, God was in the background. God was axiomatic to one's understanding of the world. But then came the Enlightenment. Man felt repressed by God, repressed by religion. He felt choked. He wanted to be alone. He wanted to rid the shackles of religion and God from his life. He did so. And then he became alone. He became alone. So then he had to develop techniques to silence the yearning for something more, something more than this world. But despite the attempts to do away, despite the attempts to explain away the yearnings for the heart for something beyond this world, the transcendence is inescapable. If you're going to take something from this lecture, I would like you to take this point. That if you do not have God in your lives, something else will fill that void and take its position. It is a fact. For some people, materialism is a form of spirituality. We no longer worship in the temple, in the synagogue, in the church or the mosque, but we worship in the mall. Some of us celebrate ceremonies of consumerism, consumption. Some people refer to as Christmas. Armed with our talisman, the credit card, we feel happy again. Why? Because we bought more stuff and we have authenticated our own existence. We have authenticated our own existence. This is why the advertising agencies know how to manipulate us. They know exactly that when we buy things, we're not buying things, we're buying meanings attached to those things. And by using powerful branding techniques, fashion and the like, advertising, messaging, they attach arbitrarily meanings and emotions to these products to manipulate us. Buy this and become happy. Buy this and become great. Buy this and we will love you. Roger Rosenblatt, in the book Consuming Desires, captures this precisely. He says, to have and not have, that is the essence of consumerism in America, and the engine of Western capitalism. To experience a moment when acquisition of stuff brings you an epiphany of sobbing, because its very being and the act of acquiring itself reminds you of the stuff you do not have, or do not have yet. The thrill of the present drags you into the want of the past, and then propels you into prayers of the future. The stuff is there and not there. Not bad for a sociologist. What is he doing here? He puts it in a comedic sense, but he captures the religiosity of consumerism. And this is how we cope in a world without God. We fall prey to the consumer lie, a pseudo-salvation. But my friends, we all know here, deep down, that this won't do. That consumerism won't make us happy. Materialism will not make us happy. It's not enough. How many of us here have been in that situation where we desired the latest product? Whether it's the iPad, iPhone. I just got one, by the way. Still trying to work out how to use it, but still got one. Whether it's the new car, or whether it's a new designer handbag. My wife has a problem with handbags. You know, now and then she'll say, honey, I found this new bag. And I look at her and I say, but we have 3. And she just looks at me confused, like, what's that got to do with it? All the ladies know what I'm talking about here. And those that aren't married, prepare for it. I guess we all have our vices. But whatever it may be, but when you attain this product, as soon as you have that product, what happens? The desire withers away. The novelty is worn off, completely worn off. Why? Because material things are temporal. Stuff is hyped. Once you've had one thing, you've had them all. And this kind of moral lesson here reminds me of a film that I watched many years ago called Scarface. Show of hands who's actually seen this film? Okay. All the guys have. The girls are like, Scarface? Is it about plastic surgery? But for those that haven't seen the film, many people think that the climax of that film is the end, where Tony Montana, played by Al Pacino, he gets his gun and says, say hello to my little friend, and starts machining gun everybody. But that's not the climax of the film. The climax of that film is halfway through it. And just to give you a background, so we have this chap, Tony Montana, from Puerto Rico, I think, if my memory does not fail me, and he's at the immigration point. And he wants to break into America, make a life for himself, a living for himself. So he's at that point where he's trying to convince the chaps to let him through. He says, look, I'm really poor, I've been poor all my life. I've been eating squid all my life, I'm fed up of squid. Let me in, let me make a life for myself. So they feel sorry for him and they let him in. So he gets a job, I think it's just washing plates or something in the kitchen, and then he starts getting into a life of crime. So he starts working in the streets, he gets involved with the drug world. And he starts working in the streets and he builds a name for himself. And the big boss, the mafia boss at that time, takes him under his wing and thinks that he has potential. So he becomes really well known for his gangster life. He becomes number 2. But then not too long after that, he becomes number 1. To the point where he kills his actual boss. And he actually marries the boss's widow, who he has loved from day one and adored, and worshipped the ground she walked on. So what happens then? He becomes the head mafia boss. The number 1 head honcho in town. Boss number 1. So now he has riches beyond his wildest dreams, the power like he could never have imagined, from cleaning plates to becoming number 1 in that city. So he's halfway through the film, he's in this plush restaurant where the waiter's wearing tuxedos. And he's sitting on that table with his friend opposite him and the woman beside him, the woman that he married, that he have always wanted. And he sits there. And he has everything now. And he has a cigar. And he says, is this it? He says, is this it? What it was made out to be was not what it turned out to be. Oscar Wilde said, there are 2 tragedies in one's life. Not getting what you want, and the other one is getting it. Libraries are full of testimonies, confession stories of people who thought that having it all was not all. We know that stuff is clearly hyped. We all know deep down that it's not going to make us happy. Pinning our hopes in the material world, it's like pinning our hopes in nothingness. That pin will just drop. And that is why God in the Quran, Allah in the Quran, He says, for the life of this world is nothing but an enjoyment of self-delusion. To think that we can be happy purely of this world is just fooling ourselves. There is nothing in this world will quench the desire for transcendence. Absolutely not. Psychologists and sociologists are discovering the pain of boredom in our lives. We have so much access at our disposal to entertain us and to make us happy, and yet it is still not enough. More than any other generation, and yet we are still bored. Not enough violence, not enough drugs, not enough sex. What is this notion that we hear from polemical atheists that somehow religion is the cause of all violence in the world that we've seen? What rubbish is that? In an era of secularism where God has been kicked out and religion has no place, we are obsessed with violence. We have children, literally children, playing computer games where the objective of the game is to indiscriminately kill people, to beat up prostitutes and take their money and do what you want with them. And then we scratch our heads and think, why is there so much violence in the world with our youth? Maybe that's got something to do with it. We hear stories of people ordering pizzas and then shooting the pizza delivery man just to see what it would be like. Without God and religion, violence is alive and kicking in our lives. I have two police officers in the audience and probably confirm what I'm saying here. Not enough sex in our lives. We have perversions that go beyond human comprehension. Don't let me get started. I don't want to lower the tone of this evening. That lose all sense of the meaning of the word sex. Just go on the internet and look at perversions. You think to yourself, where did I start? Not enough drugs in our life. Man in an era of boredom, an era without transcendence, wants to take cocktails of drugs, trance-induced music, rave parties, and it's considered a new culture. This is not culture. This is escapism. This is counter-reality. Man can't bear to live this world anymore, and yet he seeks to escape it. This is not culture. This is counter-reality. People are so dead spiritually and emotionally. So dead. That what we do is we seek the extremes. The extremes of living. Why? Because we are so dead inside that we have lost touch with the nature of existence. And we want something to activate it. Awaken within us. And that is why we seek those extremes in sex and violence and drugs. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he said the difference between the one who remembers God and does not remember God is the difference between the living and the dead. The living and the dead. So this, my friends, this alternative religion of materialism simply won't do. People want more than this. Man needs a narrative. Even if he denies God, man needs a narrative. We need a journey. We need a story. We need someone to guide us. And if we kick God out, then we will invent one in its place. We will invent a narrative. We know that consumerism has failed, because when we look at the world, we see people have an interest in spirituality. We have these cults and New Age religions and Scientology popping up. Why? Because in a secular age, these work as patchwork systems to fill the void of spirituality in our lives. Man can't just live on bread and water. He needs something more. Go to the bookstores. Books on New Age religions, crystals, tarot cards, retreats away to find oneself, to become enlightened. It's all the rage. Paganism is back. And what an intellectual tragedy. We have the mercy, the enlightenment of a monotheistic religion. Tawheed, as it's called in Arabic. And what do? We kick God out and we'd have a full reversal back to paganism. Back to paganism. But my friends, will this work? To reinvent a narrative for ourselves, will this work? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. To invent meaning is an enterprise of self-delusion. It's an enterprise of delusion. If the world, if our lives have no meaning and purpose, and to simply attach meaning to it arbitrarily, is a life of fooling ourselves. Daniel J. Levinson, in The Seasons of Man's Life, he says, as he attempts to reappraise his life A man discovers how much is based on illusion, and he is faced with the task of disillusionment. By this expression, I mean a reduction of illusions and recognition that long-held assumptions and beliefs about self and the world are not true. This process merits special attention because illusion plays so vital a role in our lives throughout the life cycle. If you recall, I mentioned a quote from Bertrand Russell. And he thought he had the answer. Listen to what he says. What he thought to be good news turned out not to be so bright. Listen to what he wrote. I wrote with a passion and force because I really thought I had a gospel. Now I'm cynical about the gospel because it won't stand the test of life. This is a man who dedicated his life to what he thought was the answer, a life without God. And then he found out that it wasn't right. Many atheists will refer to his earlier writings, but they will ignore the later writings. I wonder why. So whether it's the consumerism lie, whether it's the attempt to reinvent a narrative for ourselves, whether it's these new age religions, it simply won't do. One cannot escape the absurdity of life without God. But then what is the remedy? Depravity haunts us. How does man get out of this position that he has created? This abyss of depravity. How? Well, if you recall in my earlier part of my speech, I said there is a simple formula. I am Muslim. Now, this formula answers those questions about identity. Who am I? What am I doing here? What's the point of it all? That formula provides me meaning and purpose in my life. The universe is not an accident. It was meant to be. The universe is a product of a transcendent cause. A transcendent will that is meant to be. You are not an accident. You are supposed to be here. Your lives have significance. You're not just a chemical scum, as Stephen Hawking puts it. What defines you is not the physical, but your soul. That is what defines you. There was a moment where all the souls were in an audience of God. All the people that lived, all the people that are living now in this time, and all the people that will come to live, they were in an audience of God. And God asked every one of those souls. He said, "Who is your Lord?" And without hesitation, every single one of us replied, "You are. You are my Lord." Even Richard Dawkins. And the reason that you have a yearning for transcendence, the reason that you have this, is because your soul recalls that momentous day, that moment when your Lord asked you, "Who is your Lord?" That is why. Nothing else will fill that void. There are dimensions to our experience that can only be filled and answered existentially in a relationship with God. There's no other way. Your makeup is not of earth, but it is of the heavens. All of us here are linked to that sacred moment where God bestows upon Adam, the first man, sacredness and divineness. We are all part of that magic moment. And that's why it does matter whether you live or do not live. It does matter whether you exist or do not exist, because your life has meaning. What about purpose? Of course we have purpose. In the Quran, God, Allah, uses the word Khalif, vicegerent, a representative. You are here to live by that Lord, of the attributes that Lord is. Merciful, kind, compassionate, just. You are counted to live your life according to those attributes of God. Life does not end at the grave. No. Rumi said that death for the Muslim is like a bird being freed from a cage. Death is not the end, it is the beginning. And the decisions that you make in this life have eternal significance. So you have purpose. But not only do you just have meaning and purpose, but it is grounded in the intellect. The Quran, over and over again, speaks of evidence, reason, ponder, reflection, falsification. Falsification tests that have stood the test of time. The Quran teases and agitates the rational faculty of the reader. So not only I have meaning and purpose, but it is actually real. Now, whether you agree with what I've said this evening, there is one thing that none of us can deny. That is that one day we will not be here. We will pass away from existence. That we will die. That we won't be here. That you won't be able to see. You won't be able to touch, smell, any of those things. That all that you will be is a memory in the people that are already here. The greatest regret is a regret that you will have after you die. We all know what regret feels like. It haunts us. We wish we would have done X, Y, and Z. And the most troubling regret is the one that you will face when you die. I want to end with an extract from The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It is a novel that speaks of a man in 19th century Russia who's a high court judge who has this realization that he is mortal on his deathbed. It says, it occurred to him that what had appeared perfectly impossible before, namely that he had not spent his life as he should have done, might after all be true. It occurred to him that his scarcely perceptible attempts to struggle against what was considered good by the most highly placed people, those scarcely noticeable impulses which he had immediately suppressed, might have been real, might have been the real thing, and all the rest false. And his professional duties, and the whole arrangement of his life, of his family, and all his social and official interests might all have been false. He tried to defend all those things to himself, and suddenly felt weakness of what he was defending. There was nothing to defend. But if that is so, he said to himself, and I am leaving this life with the consciousness that I have lost all that was given to me, and it is impossible to rectify it, what then? He lay on his back and began to pass his life in review in quite a new way. In the morning, when he saw his footman, then his wife, then his daughter, and then the doctor, their every word and movement confirmed to him the awful truth that had been revealed to him during that night. In them he saw himself, all that for which he had lived, and saw clearly that it was not real at all, but a terrible and huge deception which had hidden both life and death. This consciousness intensified his physical suffering tenfold. He groaned and tossed about and pulled up at his clothing which choked him and stifled him, and he hated them on that account. I wouldn't want anybody to have that rude awakening on their deathbed. So I end on that thought, that please consider meaning and purpose in your lives and the question of Islam. Thank you for listening.
I would appreciate if you can perhaps elaborate a little bit more about how our daily life, in whatever walks that we take in terms of our professional and family life, can ultimately fulfill the purpose that you have highlighted today. Because I think it is important that many of us are here, students who are studying towards a degree. We are going to embark into a life, whether it's a life of a surgeon, a doctor, or a teacher, or a banker, or whatever. So if you just give us that guidance, that how the purpose of life can be fulfilled.
We can answer this question by referring to the Quran, where Allah says in the Quran, He says that that wealth is fine, absolutely fine. We don't subscribe to this view of asceticism, like to be some sort of a monk in a cave and just worshipping your Lord. All of that's fine, because ultimately we are immaterial beings, but we do have a material aspect. But what God says, he says, do not be distracted. Do not be dazzled by what he refers to as the dunya, the material world, dunya in Arabic. So all this is fine, but this has to be viewed as a means to an end, rather than the end itself. Now, just going back to this predicament of modern man, that things are very different. Now, you have to understand that before, many, many generations back, that they used to constantly be analysing the state of their souls. The state of their souls. You know, people used to look at the state of their souls and if they were on the right path, like we look at the lines under our eyes and our forehead. Right? We're obsessed with that kind of outlook. We spend more time. And we can see that kind of religiosity in fitness. You know, I have this lady at work, and you know, she misses a day at the gym, and she's like, she's sinned. You know, she's like, oh, I can't believe I did it. Hail Marys. You know, it's really weird. You know, you say to me, it's okay. It's not that bad. No, she's like, no, Adam, don't say that. I'm wrong. You know, I have to go twice now. You know, you get that. So, and again, that is all being distracted by the world. That is all being distracted by other functions. And in the Islamic tradition is that, you know, that having a job, fulfilling your duty, having a job, living your life in a good way is all part and parcel of this objective, the end. But one must be very, very careful not to become deluded. One become distracted by the dazzle and the glitter of the world, as it were. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, I understand that religion is becoming more secular in society, and we kind of developed into a pick and mix society. So we pick all the kind of the best bits of religions and make our own religion. I guess my question is, why Islam? Why should we pick Islam for the purpose of life?
That's a very, very good question. Why Islam? Because from the Muslim's perspective, it's the final testimony. Now, Islam does not negate the previous religions. You know, this is a misconception. What Islam is the let's say the end of the journey with respect to religion. So, Islam doesn't negate, say, Judaism or Christianity. Islam is not, let's say, presenting them to be false. Islam is just more true. It is the final testimony. It is like saying to someone, look, you're using Windows 95, why don't you use Vista or Windows 7? It's still Microsoft, right? It's still the same author, but you know, use the latest version. I said that to someone, he said, well, I use Mac. Wise guy. So from that perspective, that's why we say Islam. That's why we accept all the messages in the past. I mean, there are approximately 128,000 messengers that have been sent to the world to guide us, to confirm the previous messages and to bring new messages to us. And what Islam is the final message. Now, okay, fine, but how does one claim that? The reason for that is because if we look at it's a lecture in and of itself, but what we can say, if we look at the life of Muhammad, peace be upon him, we look at all the evidences and the background information, that the only way in which that we can explain his life, the only way we can explain the data is that it is of a supernatural endeavor. There is no naturalistic way of explaining this man's life. I mean, I was reading a book, this atheist, materialist, communist author, and he said that the only explanation is always a materialistic explanation. And he said, and in another part of the book, I can't remember the actual book, I do apologize for that, but another part of the book, he said, if there ever was a messenger, it would be Muhammad, peace be upon him. If there ever was a messenger sent to this world, it would be Muhammad, peace be upon him. And what we find is those that are skeptical about Prophet Muhammad's life, but they end up in contradictions. So they say that he's a madman, he's a liar, for example, and then they say he was sincere. Well, this is a contradiction. Either he was sincere or he was a liar. And the gist of it is this, that the only way in which that we can explain Islam and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with all the data that we have, is that it is of supernatural endeavor. There is no other way. The most coherent explanation is that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was actually receiving revelation. And that's, in a nutshell, that's why I would say Islam.
A lot of people in the world would probably, well, I suppose one could say that, which relates to this evening's talk, is that a lot of the fear in the world is that there's a fear of death. And, I suppose that's a sort of question that a lot of people in the secular world certainly don't want to answer and don't want to ever talk about. And if anyone raises it, the conversation ends very soon, doesn't it? Yeah. So I suppose then...
The weirdo in the house.
Is that, do we want to have is it right to not have a fear of death? Saying it from whatever belief one would have.
Is it right not to have a fear of death? Once you unlock that secret that there is more to this life and that you are immortal, and that in the end everything will be okay, if you stick to that principle of being with your Lord, then fear is nothing. Like I said, it's the beginning, not the end. If you're asking me personally, what I am scared of, and I am deeply troubled by, is not death, but the fact that I forget that I am mortal and that I will die. I have become subject to this machine of the world that tricks me and makes me think that I am not going to die. That is what scares me. It creeps up on me. Oh my gosh, I am actually going to die. I am actually mortal. Right? And a lot of people are at war with the aging process, but what they don't understand is that the aging process is a gift from God. It is a gift. Because it's telling you that you're mortal. Could you imagine that you are in the prime age of 21 and you maintain those looks? I'm not too far off from that. Just joking. You maintain those looks to the day that you die, and then suddenly you thought, what happened, right? I sometimes look in the mirror and think, yep, time's coming soon. Right? It's a gift from God. The fact that we are aging is a gift from God because it tells us, it's like the message, that annoying message on your BlackBerry that keeps going off that someone wants to talk to you. It tells you, it shakes the matrix. That it tells you that you are mortal. And that is the biggest fear for me, that I forget that I'm mortal, that one day I won't be here. That is the biggest fear for me, not death itself. But death for the non-believer is extremely scary. Because as human beings, we want to live as much as we can, right? Because this is it. This life is it. There's nothing beyond this, so you have to make the most out of it. So death will be very scary, a very scary place.
As like any other monotheistic religion, in Islam we also have the possibility of ending up in hell, and as well as, inshallah, ending up in heaven. So there are consequences of what we do in this small life, and we have been told many times through scripture and as well as scholars that what we saw today is we basically harvest in the afterlife when we meet the Lord. So to basically ask you the question is the concept of predestination and the concept of free will, if you may have, and the purpose of life. If you put them three together, what would you make out of it? What would be your comment about the concept of predestination, purpose of life, and if we have any free will at all?
Okay, right, so let me begin. I have another 5 more hours. Okay, what I could say here, not so that I drag on the lecture, but I would say that every one of us is in the best possible situation, time and location and gender to come and know their Lord. We're in the best, God has put us in the best possible position to come and to know Him and to realize His existence and to have that relationship with Him. Now, the question of of free will, yes, no one puts, let's say, that God does not put anyone into the hellfire. He doesn't put anyone into hell. Who puts themselves into the hellfire? Is ourselves. We reject God, we spit in the face of God, and we decide to go into the hellfire. Because God gives us every sign, every opportunity, and puts us in the best position to come and to escape that and to come into heaven for an infinite amount of happiness and joy. Now, some may say, well, what happens to the people that are in between? Now, that objection assumes somewhat that there is this kind of binary outlook. That either that only Muslims go into heaven and everyone who's not a Muslim goes to the hellfire. It's not like that. It is not like that. It's more nuanced. There are many grey areas. God will, and this is what I say about this. I say that salvation is relative to your information and your environment. Not everyone's the same. And Imam Ghazali, in his book of Tolerance, spoke about this, that people who, in his time, the West, for example, he said those individuals that reject Islam, don't come to Islam, will not be accountable for someone who, like, for example, the Quraysh, some members of the Quraysh, the tribe during the 7th century period of the Prophet Muhammad's life, who knew Islam was true and rejected it. Because these Christians that Imam Ghazali was referring to are people that heard about just terrible things about Islam. That I've seen this picture that a Muslim was seen as like a devil-like creature with horns, and that Muslims somehow used to go around worshipping the devil, if you like. So if someone in that period comes to know Islam in this form and rejects Islam, what is he rejecting? Does he reject Islam, or does he reject that perverted image of Islam? He's rejecting something else. He's not rejecting Islam. Now that person is not going to the hellfire. We can't say he's going to the hellfire. What we know is that God is most just and merciful. And he will look at that person. He will look at that person, how they lived. Did they do good deeds? Was that person, did he do his utmost effort to find God? So we have this mixture. Like the word, for example, kafir, many Muslims use it, right? In a derogatory sense. Now, kafir is not someone who does not give you way on the motorway, right? Kafir, right? We use this in the wrong way, right? And I apologize to any non-Muslim that has had that experience. A kafir means someone who knows Islam is true and rejects it. Kafir comes from the Arabic word kafara, which means to conceal, because the Arabs at that time, they used to have cattle with diseases and they used to cover it. This was called kafara, right? So a kafir, someone who's destined to the hellfire, it's someone who knows Islam is true and rejects it out of his arrogance. And this is one understanding of it. So all that, the answer to your question is that that's how it all fits in, that God has given us the best possible situation to come and to know him and to discover him and to discover Islam. And that that salvation is relative to one's information and environment. Hope that answers your question.
Hi. Today your lecture was about purpose of life, but could you explain more about how the Quran could be a guide in life?
Yes. The Quran itself is a framework in which we can live our lives. It gives us those moral frameworks. Now, as human beings, we adhere to what we consider to have in place objective morals, objective morality. We need morality to function. If we don't have morality, then life would just be chaotic. We wouldn't know what was good and what was bad, or what was good and evil. We would be absolutely chaotic. So we apprehend, for example, if we just take religion out for a second, take Islam out the equation for a second, we as human beings, we apprehend a sense of morality, a moral realm. And there are things that we can all agree, like, for example, torturing a child for fun is evil. You don't have to believe in God to know that, right? Everybody would agree, I hope so. Yes, please say yes. Yes, okay. Good, we still have a future. But there are some things that become blurred. It's not so easy. Like, for example, abortion. Some people say that like, for example, this ethical question of euthanasia. Topics like this, abortion, some people say that yes, after a certain period, some people say no. Peter Singer, actually a philosopher, teaches in the United States, he says that humans can commit infanticide, even when the baby is born up to about a month, maybe a couple of days more. You can actually kill your children, if you like, right? Because he considers us to be animals, and that is a consequence of that, because animals commit infanticide all the time. So, in some moral matters, our apprehension becomes jaded. Now, what the Quran is, if you like, is moral technology. Moral technology to understand and to discover those things that we are confused about. So the Quran, it gives us that framework in which that we can operate in our lives, and also it tells us our condition, our humble beginnings, and what we are, so forth, and gives us moral stories in to live our lives. So the Quran is a guide to life. It is a moral framework in which that one we can live and be secure about our moral choices.
And I think going back to a few questions which have been asked, if I am a Christian or I am a Hindu or a Jew, I believe in God, and there have been instances where non-Muslims have made a huge difference out of the context of consumerism. So do we say that they did not find the purpose in their lives, or today a Jew or a Christian cannot find his purpose in life?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, I want to establish this philosophical point. God is not so much interested in the conclusion, right? He's interested in your efforts in the journey. So if you strived and made those efforts to find God, and you didn't end up at Islam, but because you used your reason, you researched, you had the sincerity, intellectual integrity, then you will find salvation in that sense. That's what I mean, it's relative. It's relative to the information in your environment. So one can find salvation in that sense because he has exerted his effort to find God. But he came in front of obstacles, but he can't be... The thing about Islam is that one can't be accountable for something that's beyond their control. Because what kind of a just God would that be? Right? Because God is most just, even if you're not Muslim, he will account you for the good that you did in your life and the effort that you showed in your life to come and know him. So those individuals may find salvation in that sense. The pinnacle is Islam, but the journey is important. Sometimes more important than the pinnacle.
I was just, in a world that we live in today, I often find myself struggling in arguments with an atheist of the existence of God. Is there really a God? And I don't know, maybe it's down to my lack of understanding of my own religion, which obviously is unfortunate. And also, but the question I have to you, of course, is that in the modern world now, everything which is deemed as true has to be kind of factual, based on factual evidence of what you can feel, touch, see, and hear, kind of thing. What chance does religion have, not just Islam, but the religion and the concept of God and the concept of spirituality and something that you can't see, can't feel and touch, but something that you can honestly feel? What chance does that have? What chances does religion have, kind of thing, to revive religion? And I think you made a very good point earlier of we're going back to kind of pagan times of believing in silly things like Scientology and whatever. I don't insult anyone or anything, but so what chance do we have?
Okay, good question. So in an era that demands evidence and facts, then where does religion and, let's say, Islam fall? Well, the problem there is but when you engage with many atheists, and if you read popular sort of polemical atheist literature like Richard Dawkins' work, Peter Atkins, that piece of literature is predicated upon something called scientism. And its older form was called logical positivism, and that is the idea that knowledge is only defined by the empirical method. That knowledge is only defined by touch, see and smell, etc., etc. But the problem with that is that it's a flawed theory of knowledge. the first thing I would say there is that it discards, and one has to be shrewd about this. We have to identify this, because if you don't, then you're going to be on a wild goose chase. Because whatever evidence you give to them that is not empirical, they're never going to accept, right? So we have to be careful about this when we're engaging with individuals such as atheists, or agnostics, if you like, or scientists that are trained in the hard sciences. But the problem with this theory is that it discards a tremendous amount of what we consider to be true in our day-to-day discourse. For example, aesthetic truths, like when someone looks at the sun's setting and we say that is a beautiful scenery. Now, beauty, aesthetics, cannot be captured by the empirical method, by scientism, if you like. But do we now discard the meaning of such a term as beauty, that it's a beautiful sunset? We can all understand here what that means, right? Okay, we can all, it's a meaningful proposition to say something is beautiful. The other thing that it discards is many metaphysical facts that we regard to be true. For example, that the external world is real. We cannot prove by, say, scientism or the empirical method that the external world is actually real. This is a philosophical consideration. How do we know now that your brain is not in a chemical vat being stimulated thinking that you're enjoying this lecture now? How do you know that? I'm sure you are enjoying it, right? Yeah. But how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat? The only way, we can't falsify that hypothesis by using science. We use philosophy, reason, to say that we can be warranted in saying that the external world is real, or the fact that other minds exist. How do we know that other minds exist except of our own? These, again, are metaphysical facts that can't be explained by empiricism or scientism or logical positivism. The other point here is also ethical statements. How can you empirically identify something is good? For example, the question to experiment on monkeys is wrong or evil. Empiricism can tell you what the effects are, but it can't tell you good or evil, any of those things. You can't find good and evil in a test tube. You can't construct an experiment because of the chemical reaction, if you like, good pops up or bad pops up or evil pops up. That doesn't work, right? But we don't have to appeal to external arguments to show that this is a flawed theory of knowledge, epistemology, if you like. The statement that says, and the underpinning of scientism is this statement here. It says, a statement is only deemed meaningful if it is subject to the 5 senses. Right? So a proposition like God exists is meaningless because one can't touch and see God, and that's what the brother was saying. But ask yourself this. What about that statement itself? Is that statement subject to the 5 senses? No, it's not. So the very standard of knowledge that the system puts out itself does not apply to that system. So it implodes. It's like saying, I don't speak a word of English. Right? It's an arbitrary criteria to determine what knowledge is, what is meaningful, what is meaningless. So you could, from the outset, when you engage with atheists, that you have to deal with that little sort of sleight of hand, if you like, that you have to define what reason is. And once you do that, then you can engage in reason and philosophy, and you can use science to argue for God's existence, but ultimately it rests upon the use of philosophy and science, for example.